Eddie Garcia, a successful businessman from Los Angeles, woke up one day to find his bank accounts empty and his company on the brink of collapse. Someone had set him up, and suspicion fell on those closest to him. To clear his name and restore justice, he decides to pretend to be bankrupt and see who will stand by him in his hour of need. But what he discovers will turn his life upside down. Eddie Garcia stood at the huge panoramic window of his Beverly Hills mansion, looking out at the sprawling yard below. The pool sparkled under the California sun, palm trees swayed gently in the breeze, and in the distance, he could see the gazebo where his 17-year-old daughter Isabella loved to take stories for social media. The house was the epitome of success: marble floors, furniture by famous designers, paintings by contemporary artists on the walls. Eddie, a 35-year-old construction magnate, had built his empire from scratch in 15 years of hard work. His company built skyscrapers in Los Angeles, residential complexes in San Diego, and even bridges in Northern California. He was the pride of his family, or so he thought. His wife Maria entered the living room, her eyes glued to her phone. Her long nails tapped the screen as she flipped through a boutique catalog. "Eddie, I need $5,000 for a dress for Sarah's party," she said in an even voice, as if it were not a request, but a fact he was obliged to accept. She didn't even look up, her dark hair falling over her face, hiding the expression in her eyes. Eddie turned to her, trying to hide the fatigue in his voice. "Maria, you spent $3,000 on a bag last week. Maybe that's enough." She finally looked at him, narrowing her eyes. "You want me to look like a slob? It's your reputation, by the way." She snorted and buried her face in her phone again. At that moment, Isabella burst into the room, her curls bouncing in time with her steps. She was holding a box of new sneakers, which, judging by the logo, cost at least $1,000. "Dad, look how cool they are. But I still need jeans to complete the look. Can you transfer a couple thousand?" She chirped, showing off her purchase. Her eyes sparkled, but there was no doubt in them that her father would agree. To her, he was not a person, but an ATM that always dispensed the right amount of cash. Eddie stared at his daughter and felt a void growing inside him. He clenched his fists but said nothing. Only his son Mateo, a 17-year-old boy with a pensive look, seemed different. He entered the living room with a mug of coffee in his hands and quietly sat down on the sofa. "Dad, how about we go fishing this weekend? It's been a while," he suggested, looking at his father with a sincere smile. Eddie nodded, grateful for this small island of warmth in a cold sea of indifference. Mateo was not like his mother and sister. He didn't demand or beg. He just wanted to spend time together. But even that couldn't fill the void that was growing in Eddie's heart. He began to suspect that his family didn't love him, but his money. The next morning, everything changed. Eddie woke up to a call from his accountant, Tom. "Eddie, we have a problem." Tom's voice trembled. "The company's accounts are empty. The assets are frozen. Someone withdrew millions overnight. We're on the verge of bankruptcy." Eddie froze, feeling the blood drain from his face. "How is this possible?" he managed to say, clenching the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Tom hesitated. "It looks like a data leak. Someone on the inside gave our competitors access. I'm looking into it, but you need to be prepared for anything." Eddie hung up and stared into space. His company, his life, everything was falling apart. But the worst part was that he was beginning to suspect those closest to him. He went down to the living room, where Maria was already leafing through another catalog. "Maria, were you talking to someone on the phone late last night?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She looked up and frowned. "A friend? Why?" Her answer was too quick, too sharp. Eddie nodded, but suspicion gnawed at his chest. Isabella was sitting on the couch, filming a video of her new sneakers. "Dad, you promised to transfer the money," she reminded him, without looking up from the screen. Eddie didn't answer. His thoughts revolved around one idea. Someone had betrayed him, and that someone could be in this house. By evening, he had made up his mind. Eddie contacted Tom and transferred all his remaining personal funds to a secret account that no one knew about. Then he wrote a letter to his partners announcing his fictitious bankruptcy. It was a game, but he had to know the truth. The next morning, he gathered his family in the living room. Maria sat with her legs crossed, flipping through a magazine. Isabella was taking selfies. Mateo just stared at his father, sensing that something was wrong. "I have some bad news," Eddie began, trying to keep his voice steady. "The business has gone bankrupt. We've lost everything. We have to leave this house today." Maria dropped the magazine, her eyes wide with horror. "What?" she cried, jumping up. "You're joking, right? Where's my money? How am I going to live?" Isabella froze with the phone in her hands. "Dad, are you serious? Does this mean we're destitute now?" Mateo frowned but said nothing. "We have an old shack in the San Fernando Valley," Eddie replied coldly, ending the conversation. "That's where we're going." Maria rolled her eyes, and Isabella burst into tears. "To the village? There's no internet there. It's a nightmare." Only Mateo approached his father and said quietly, "Dad, I'm with you. We'll manage." Eddie put his hand on his shoulder, feeling his heart tighten with gratitude. The drive to the San Fernando Valley took 3 hours. Maria sat next to him, demonstratively turning away to look out the window. Isabella whined from the back seat. "I'm getting carsick. My phone is dead. This is hell." Mateo was silent, staring out the window at the passing fields. When they pulled up to the hut, the sun was already setting. The little house looked pitiful. The roof was sagging, the windows were covered with dust, and weeds grew around it. Maria crossed the threshold and grimaced. "Is this my home now? There's not even a shower." "There's a well in the yard," Eddie replied calmly, putting the bags on the floor. Isabella threw down her backpack and collapsed onto the creaky sofa. "I'm not staying here. This is horrible." Mateo took a bucket and went to the well. "Dad, let me get some water," he said, ignoring his mother and sister's whining. Eddie smiled at him, feeling a faint hope rising in his chest. He knew this was only the beginning. The experiment had begun, and now he would see who his family really was. But deep down, he already had a feeling that the truth would be bitter. At night, he lay on the hard mattress, listening to Maria and Isabella toss and turn and complain, while Mateo breathed quietly beside him. A dog barked outside the window, and Eddie could think of only one thing: which one of them had sold his dreams? The morning in the San Fernando Valley greeted Eddie Garcia with a cold wind that blew dust across the overgrown yard of the old shack. He woke up first, went out onto the porch, and looked around his new kingdom: a crooked fence, a rusty barrel by the well, grass up to his knees. Yesterday's move had exhausted everyone, but Eddie felt a strange sense of relief. His plan was in motion. He had pretended to be bankrupt, transferred millions to a secret account, and now he was watching to see how his family would behave without their usual luxuries. This was his chance to find out the truth. Which of them was with him for love and which for money? Inside the hut, a floorboard creaked. Mateo, his 17-year-old son, came out with a bucket in his hands. "Dad, let's chop some wood." "It's cold in here," he suggested, rubbing his hands together. His dark eyes shone with calm, and Eddie smiled involuntarily. "Sure, son," he nodded, picked up the axe, and headed for the barn. They worked in silence. Mateo gathered kindling, Eddie chopped old logs. The sun rose higher, and for the first time in a long time, Eddie felt like a father, not a businessman. Maria appeared on the porch later, wrapped in a silk robe that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of the village dirt. Her hair was tousled, and there were dark circles under her eyes. "Eddie, this is unbearable," she complained, fanning herself with an old magazine she had found in a trunk. "There's not even any decent coffee here. How could you drag us here?" Her voice trembled with irritation. Eddie didn't answer, just hit the wood harder with the axe. Isabella came out next, holding a dead phone in her hands. "The battery is dead, and there's no charger. How am I going to live?" she whined, plopping down on the step next to her mother. Her face was red from crying, but Eddie saw anger in her eyes, not sadness. "You'll live like everyone else here," he snapped, not looking at them. He understood that their discontent was a test not only for them, but for him as well. Mateo brought water from the well, and he and his father built a fire in the yard. Eddie found an old pot, threw some potatoes into it, and put it on the fire. The smell of cooked food reminded him of his childhood, when he and his grandfather used to cook like this in the backyard in East Los Angeles. It was simple, but it was real happiness. Maria and Isabella grimaced. "Is that food for beggars?" Isabella snorted, folding her arms. "I'm not eating that," Maria chimed in, turning away demonstratively. By noon, Eddie and Mateo got to work on the plot. They dug up the beds and planted potatoes and carrots, hoping that at least something would grow. Eddie taught his son how to hold a shovel and how to loosen the soil. "Look, the main thing is not to rush," he said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. Mateo nodded and smiled, and Eddie felt that something real was growing between them. Maria and Isabella sat on the porch, whispering to each other. "If Dad hadn't gone broke, I'd be in Malibu right now," Isabella whined, twirling a strand of hair. "It's all his fault," Maria agreed, casting a contemptuous glance at her husband. Eddie pretended not to hear, but every word stabbed him like a needle. At night, he lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling. Mateo snored nearby, while Maria and Isabella tossed and turned on their creaky mattresses, complaining about how hard they were. The wind howled outside, and Eddie thought about how the experiment was already bearing fruit. Maria and Isabella made no secret of their disgust for their new life, but Mateo remained by his side. It warmed his heart, but it didn't answer the main question: who had betrayed him in Beverly Hills? He remembered Maria's phone call yesterday. She spoke quietly, almost in a whisper, and quickly hid the phone when he entered. He couldn't get it out of his head. The next day, the tension grew. Eddie noticed that Maria was leaving more often. "I'm going for a walk," she said in the morning, throwing on a light jacket. Her voice was too casual, and her gaze was evasive. She returned a couple of hours later with a slight blush on her cheeks and the scent of someone else's cologne. "Where were you?" Eddie asked, frowning. I went for a walk in the woods, she replied, avoiding his eyes. He said nothing, but his suspicion grew stronger. Isabella sat on the porch all day, leafing through an old magazine and muttering, "When will we get back to normal?" In the evening, Eddie decided to check Maria's phone while she was asleep. He crept over to her bag, took the phone, and turned on the screen. The password, their wedding date, worked. There was an unfamiliar number in the recent calls list and a short message. "Meet me tomorrow at the store." Eddie's heart began to race. Who was X? And why was Maria hiding this from him? He put the phone back, feeling a mixture of anger and pain boiling inside him. She was up to something, and he had to find out what. On the third day, Javier Ramirez appeared in the village, a tall man with a confident gait and an expensive suit. He arrived in a black SUV, supposedly to check out some land. Eddie saw him from a distance while chopping wood. Javier stopped at the local store, and Maria, as if on cue, went out to buy bread. She put on her best dress, which had miraculously survived in a suitcase, and headed there. Eddie tensed up but didn't follow her. He decided to wait and watch. Mateo, meanwhile, was helping to repair the fence. "Dad, have you noticed how strange Mom's been acting?" he asked quietly, hammering a nail. Eddie nodded. "I have, son. Just give her some time." He didn't want to involve Mateo in his suspicions, but the boy was too observant. By evening, Maria returned, her eyes sparkling and a slight smile playing on her lips. "You look happy," Eddie remarked, trying to hide the coldness in his voice. "Just the fresh air," she replied, looking away too quickly. Eddie couldn't sleep again that night. He sat by the fire, staring at the smoldering coals. Maria was hiding something, and that X was the key. He remembered Tom's words. Data leak. Could Maria be involved? Or was it Isabella, who would so easily sell family secrets for new clothes? Or maybe he was wrong, and the traitor was someone else. Eddie clenched his fists, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. The experiment was gaining momentum, and the truth was close. But was he ready to accept it? The week in the San Fernando Valley dragged on slowly, like an old truck on a dusty road. The shack, smelling of damp and old wood, became the arena for Eddie Garcia's experiment. He pretended to be bankrupt to test his family, and now every day brought new discoveries, bitter as morning coffee brewed over a campfire. Eddie chopped wood, repaired the fence, and planted vegetable beds, but his mind was preoccupied with other things. Which of his loved ones had betrayed him, stealing millions and framing the company? Mateo, his 17-year-old son, was his only ally. The boy helped his father without complaint. He carried water from the well, dug the ground, and even tried to joke to lighten the mood. "Dad, if the potatoes grow, we'll open a restaurant," he said with a smile, wiping sweat from his forehead. Eddie smiled back, but it was a forced smile. Mateo was like an anchor keeping him from falling into the abyss of despair. But Maria and Isabella were drifting further and further away with each passing day. Maria disappeared from the hut more and more often. "I'm going to pick berries," she would say, throwing on a light jacket, but she would return without a basket, with a gleam in her eyes and the scent of expensive cologne. Her excuses became less and less plausible, and Eddie felt suspicion tightening in his chest. Isabella, meanwhile, sat on the porch all day, leafing through an old magazine or complaining about the lack of internet. "This isn't life. It's hell," she whined, twirling her hair. Her irritation grew, but Eddie noticed how she kept glancing at the road, as if waiting for someone. One morning, Mateo returned from the well and quietly said to his father, "Dad, yesterday I saw Mom talking to that man in the SUV. They were standing outside the store, and she was laughing." His voice faltered, and pain flashed in his eyes. Eddie clenched his jaw but nodded. "Thanks, son. Don't worry about it." He didn't want Mateo to suffer, but his son's words confirmed his worst suspicions. That man, Javier Ramirez, a slick-looking businessman from out of town, was clearly involved with Maria. Eddie remembered the message on her phone. "Meet me tomorrow at the store." It was him. By noon, Maria had left again to take a walk. Eddie decided to follow her. He waited until she disappeared around the corner, then followed at a distance. At the village store, a crooked shed with a sign, he saw her. Maria was standing next to Javier, fixing her hair and smiling in a way she hadn't smiled at Eddie in years. Javier was saying something, touching her hand, and she was nodding, beaming as if he had promised her the stars. Eddie froze behind a tree, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. He wanted to go up to her, grab her by the shoulder, and ask her what she was doing, but he held back. He needed proof, not an argument. When he returned to the cabin, he didn't say a word all day. Maria came back in the evening, her dress smelling of tobacco and something sweet. "Were you out walking in the woods again?" Eddie asked, without looking up from the fire. "Yes, the air is fresh," she replied, looking away too quickly. Her lie was so obvious that Eddie could barely contain his anger. He understood that Maria wasn't just flirting. She was making plans that didn't include him. Isabella, meanwhile, wasn't sitting around either. Carlos Mendez, a neighbor from the big house on the hill, had arrived in the village. He was in his 30s, and his shiny pickup truck stood out among the local clunkers. Isabella ran into him at the store while buying soda. Carlos smiled when he noticed her bright T-shirt among the gray faces of the villagers. "You don't belong in this godforsaken place," he said, adjusting his hat. "I can show you a different life." Isabella was thrilled by his words. She was tired of washing dishes in cold water and sleeping on a creaky mattress. She agreed to meet him that evening. Eddie noticed that Isabella was getting dressed up. She found some glitter in her suitcase and put it on her eyelashes, even though it looked ridiculous in the village. "Where are you going?" he asked as she headed for the door. "Just going for a walk," she muttered, not looking at her father. Eddie said nothing, but his heart ached. His daughter, whom he had rocked in his arms and read fairy tales to, was slipping away into someone else's life. He felt like he was losing her, and it hurt more than Maria's lies. The next day, Mateo witnessed a scene that turned everything upside down. He went to the store for salt and saw Isabella with Carlos at his pickup truck. Carlos handed her a shiny box. It looked like jewelry. Isabella laughed, hugged him, and Mateo heard her whisper, "With you, I'll forget this dump." He froze, feeling his heart sink. His sister, his best friend since childhood, had traded her family for trinkets. Mateo returned to the shack and told his father everything. "Dad, she's dating some rich guy," he blurted out, lowering his eyes. Eddie nodded, but inside he was boiling. Isabella was following in her mother's footsteps, the path of betrayal. By evening, the tension in the hut had become unbearable. Eddie sat by the fire, staring at the stars. Mateo settled down next to him, tossing sticks into the fire. "Dad, do you think they've abandoned us?" he asked quietly. Eddie shook his head. "I don't know yet, son, but we'll find out." He didn't want to tell Mateo that he suspected Maria of leaking company information. It would be too much for the boy to handle, but he decided to take action. Eddie contacted Tom, his accountant, using an old phone hidden in his backpack. "Tom, check Maria's calls for the last month, and find out everything you can about Javier Ramirez," he whispered while the family slept. The next morning, Maria left again to meet Javier. Eddie noticed that she was wearing the earrings he had given her for their 10th anniversary. It cut him like a knife. Isabella also disappeared after lunch, muttering something about going for a walk. Eddie stayed behind with Mateo, repairing the roof. "Dad, I don't understand why they're like this," Mateo said, hammering a nail. His voice trembled with hurt. Eddie put his hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes people get lost, son, but you and I are sticking together." Mateo nodded, and determination flashed in his eyes. By evening, Tom sent a message. "Javier isn't just a businessman. He's connected to your former partner, John Cruz." And yes, Maria called Cruz 3 times in the week before the crash. Eddie read it as he sat by the fire and felt the ground slip away beneath his feet. His wife, his Maria, was part of the conspiracy that had destroyed his company. He clenched his phone so hard that the screen cracked. Anger, pain, and despair mingled in his chest, but he knew he couldn't scream. He needed proof to clear his name. The experiment had revealed the truth, but it was worse than he could have imagined. What would Maria do next? And how far would Isabella go? Eddie stared into the fire, a new plan forming in his mind. The days in the San Fernando Valley passed slowly, but for Eddie Garcia, each one was like walking through a minefield. His experiment, a fake bankruptcy, had revealed the true colors of those closest to him. Mateo, his 17-year-old son, stayed close, helping to repair the shack and keeping his father company with quiet conversations by the fire. But Maria and Isabella, his wife and daughter, were sinking deeper into their illusions, distancing themselves from him. Eddie knew that Maria was involved with Javier Ramirez and that Isabella was infatuated with Carlos Mendez. And now a message from Tom, his accountant, confirmed the worst. Maria had called John Cruz, Eddie's former partner, before the company collapsed. The truth was close, and it burned like hot coals. The morning began with the usual routine. Eddie and Mateo dug the garden beds, hoping for a good harvest. The sun beat down mercilessly, sweat dripping down their faces, but the work distracted them from their heavy thoughts. "Dad, have you noticed how Mom's been looking at you?" Mateo asked, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. Eddie nodded. "I've noticed, son. She's hiding something." He didn't mention the calls from Cruz. Mateo was already worried enough. Maria came out onto the porch in her silk robe, her arms crossed. "Eddie, how much longer are we going to rot here?" she snapped, her voice as cold as the morning wind. "Until we figure it out," he replied, not looking up from his shovel. Isabella appeared behind him, holding the empty box from Carlos's gift. "I want to leave. This place is killing me," she declared, throwing the box into the grass. Her eyes were red from crying, but Eddie saw anger in them, not sadness. He remained silent, but inside he was boiling. His daughter and wife hadn't just turned their backs on him. They were looking for a way out, without regard for him. At that moment, Eddie's old phone, hidden in his jacket pocket, rang. It was Tom. Eddie, I have news. The accountant's voice trembled. I found a recording of Maria's call with Cruz. She gave him the passwords to your accounts, and Javier is his front man. They were planning to clean you out and take off. Eddie froze, feeling the blood rush to his temples. Are you sure? He squeezed out, clenching the phone. 100%. I have the audio, Tom replied. Eddie hung up and looked at Maria, who was still standing on the porch, leafing through a magazine. Her face was calm, almost serene, and that enraged him even more. She had ruined his life, his business, for what? For the promises of some con man? He clenched his fists but held back. He didn't need shouting. He needed proof to end this legally. In the afternoon, Maria went out again to pick berries. Eddie decided to take action. He asked Mateo to watch the garden and went to the store where he usually saw her with Javier. Hiding behind an old oak tree, he watched. Javier was standing by his SUV, Maria next to him, wearing the same dress he had given her for their anniversary. Javier was holding her hand, whispering something, and she was nodding, smiling radiantly. Eddie took out his phone and turned on the recording. Are you sure Cruz took care of everything? He heard Maria's voice say. Yes, baby. The money is already in the offshore account. We'll be leaving for Miami soon, Javier replied with a smirk. Eddie turned off the recording, feeling everything inside him freeze. This was it, proof of her betrayal. Returning to the cabin, he found Isabella engaged in a new activity. She was sitting on the sofa, trying on cheap earrings that Carlos had apparently given her. Where were you yesterday? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Out for a walk, she muttered, not looking at him. Eddie nodded, but noticed the gleam in her eyes. The same gleam Maria had after meeting Javier. That evening, Mateo approached his father by the fire. Dad, I saw Isabella with that man in the pickup truck. He gave her money, he said quietly, lowering his head. Eddie clenched his jaw. Thanks, son. I'll take care of it. His daughter had sold herself, just like Maria. The family was falling apart before his eyes. The next day, fate took another turn. Eddie was sitting on the porch when his neighbor, elderly Mrs. Rodriguez, approached him. Her eyes sparkled with gossip. Eddie, did you know your wife is seeing that Javier guy? They were seen at a cafe, and he promised to buy her a house in the city, she blurted out, twisting her apron. Eddie nodded. I heard, Mrs. Rodriguez. Thank you. She left, and he remained seated, digesting her words. Javier was a con man, and Maria had fallen for his lies. But what was worse was that she had sold him out for it. By evening, Eddie decided to confront them face to face. When Maria returned, he met her at the door. Where were you? He asked, looking her in the eyes. In the woods, she replied, but her voice trembled. With Javier? He asked, and her face turned pale. Are you following me? She cried, taking a step back. I know about Cruz, about the passwords, about everything, he said quietly, but each word fell like a stone. Maria froze, her eyes widened, but she quickly regained her composure. You drove us here yourself. I wanted to live, not rot in this hole, she shouted, clenching her fists. Eddie looked at her and saw not his wife, but a stranger. You sold me for empty promises, he said, turning away and walking back to the fire. Maria remained standing, her shoulders shaking, but there were no tears. Isabella, hearing the shouting, ran into the room. What's going on? She asked, but Eddie didn't answer. He had already made up his mind. That night, he called Tom. Get the papers ready for court. I have a recording. Cruz and his men will pay for this. Tom agreed. Hang in there, Eddie. We'll get them. The next morning, something unexpected happened in the village. Javier was arrested. It turned out that he had not only deceived Maria, but also the local farmers, buying up land with forged documents. The police raided the store, and Eddie saw him being led away in handcuffs. Maria stood aside, her face white as chalk. She realized that her savior was a con artist. Isabella was also devastated. Carlos was taken away for debts, and his pickup truck was confiscated. She returned to the shack, throwing her earrings on the floor. This is all your fault, she shouted at her father, but Eddie just shook his head. He gathered his things, took Mateo, and said, let's go home, son. They got into the old Wazik and drove off to Los Angeles, leaving Maria and Isabella in the shack. Eddie looked in the rearview mirror and saw their silhouettes dissolve into dust. The truth had come out, and it was heavy, but he knew this wasn't the end. He would get his name back legally, and those who had betrayed him would pay. Mateo put his hand on his shoulder. We'll be okay, Dad. Eddie nodded, feeling hope springing up in his chest. Eddie Garcia and his son Mateo were driving down the highway in Los Angeles, leaving behind the dusty San Fernando Valley and the old shack where their family had finally fallen apart. The old Wazik creaked around the corners, but Eddie felt a strange sense of relief. The experiment, the fake bankruptcy, had shown him the truth. Maria and Isabella had betrayed him for illusions, but Mateo had stayed by his side. Now, with the recording of Maria and Javier's conversation in his pocket, he was ready to reclaim his name and his business. The sky over Beverly Hills was gray, Low clouds promised rain, but for Eddie it was a sign of a new beginning. When they pulled up to the mansion, Mateo exhaled, "Wow, Dad, are we really back?" The white walls, huge windows, and manicured lawn seemed as grand as ever, but now there was something unfamiliar about them. Eddie parked the car and turned to his son. "It was a lesson, Mateo," he said, looking him in the eyes. His voice was firm, but there was a hint of pain in it. "I wanted to show you that what matters in life isn't money or things, but the people who stay with you when everything falls apart." Mateo was silent, digesting the words, then nodded. His eyes flashed with understanding mixed with sadness. They entered the house. Mateo froze in the living room, touching the leather sofas, running his fingers over the smooth table, touching the picture frames on the walls. Everything was familiar, but it was like a different life. "You lied to us," he said quietly, turning to his father. There was no anger in his voice, only slight surprise and something like admiration. Eddie lowered his gaze. "I'm sorry, son. I wanted you to see the truth, and I'm proud of you. You stayed with me." He put his hand on his shoulder, and Mateo smiled for the first time in a week without a trace of anxiety. The next day, Eddie met with Tom, his accountant. They sat in an office in downtown Los Angeles, surrounded by folders and laptops. "Here's the recording," Eddie said, handing him his phone. Tom listened to the audio, where Maria and Javier discussed stealing the money and fleeing to Miami. "This is solid, Eddie," Tom nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "With this, we can nail Cruz and your wife. Javier's already under arrest, but Cruz is the big fish." Eddie clenched his fists. "Get the lawsuit ready. I want everything done by the book." Tom smiled. "Already on it." The trial took 2 weeks. Eddie filed a lawsuit against John Cruz for fraud and embezzlement, attaching the recording and information from Tom. Maria was also called as an accomplice, but her role was limited to passing on passwords, enough to ruin her reputation, but not enough to put her in jail. In the courtroom, Eddie sat next to Mateo, listening to Cruz's lawyer try to justify his client's actions. "My client was unaware of Javier's actions," he insisted, but the recording shattered all his arguments. The judge, an elderly woman with a sharp gaze, delivered her verdict. Cruz was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and Javier received 3 years for complicity. Eddie's company was reinstated, and his accounts were unfrozen. Maria stood aside, her face pale, her eyes dull. She approached Eddie after the hearing. "You ruined my life," she hissed, clutching her purse. Eddie looked at her coldly. "You chose this path yourself. Live with the consequences." She turned away, her shoulders shaking, but he no longer felt any pity. Isabella also appeared in court but did not say a word. Her dreams of luxury with Carlos had been shattered, and she looked lost. Eddie did not speak to her. She had made her choice. A week later, he and Mateo were sitting in the living room of the mansion by the fireplace. For the first time in months, they had lit a fire, and the crackling of the wood filled the room with warmth. "Dad, let's plant apple trees in the yard, like Grandpa did in East Los Angeles," Mateo suggested, tossing a log onto the fire. Eddie nodded. "Good idea. And we'll hang a hammock. You can read there." They discussed how to make the house feel alive, not just beautiful, and the past gradually faded away, dissolving into their quiet voices. Eddie realized he had found peace, not in money, but in the son who had stayed with him. Meanwhile, in the San Fernando Valley, life went on as usual. Maria and Isabella stayed in the shack, clinging to the remnants of their dreams. A local gossip, an old man named Jose, stopped by. He sat down on the porch, rubbing his hands. "I hear you're Eddie's rich again, living in Beverly Hills like a king," he said with a sly smile. Maria laughed, throwing her head back. "Rich? He's a loser, Jose." "Those are fairy tales," she replied, wiping away tears of laughter. Isabella snorted. "Right, he's broke." They didn't believe a word of it, too immersed in their fantasies of a future with Javier, who would save them despite his arrest. Jose shrugged and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Maria and Isabella remained on the porch, making plans for their new life. "When Javier gets out, he'll take us to Miami," Maria dreamed, staring into space. "And I'll find someone better than Carlos," Isabella added, fixing her hair. They laughed, interrupting each other, not noticing how the wind carried their words away. They didn't understand that true happiness, the kind that can't be bought, had remained in Los Angeles with Eddie and Mateo. A month later, Eddie stood at the window of the mansion, looking at the new garden. Mateo was digging a hole for an apple tree, humming something under his breath. The company was picking up steam again. Clients were returning, and Eddie Garcia's name had been cleared of all charges. He had won more than just a court case. He had regained his dignity. Maria and Isabella could have come back begging for forgiveness, but he knew their place was now there, in the shack, with their empty dreams. Eddie turned to Mateo and said, "Son, this is our home and our life." Mateo smiled. "You're right, Dad. We did this together." The rain began to fall, tapping on the roof, But the living room was warm. Eddie looked at his son and felt that justice had prevailed. Those who had betrayed him were reaping the rewards of their actions, while he had gained something more, a family, a real one, albeit a small one. It was a victory worth fighting for, and he had achieved it honestly, by the law, just as he had promised himself from the very beginning.